So on tonight, I've said a bit already, but I'm just going to introduce our speakers and explain the format for tonight. And then the speakers will come up and speak briefly from their own perspectives about how science and the church might want to talk to each other and why that might be. So 4 speakers tonight, and we are going to then take a short break of about 20 minutes. And there's an opportunity for you to write your questions down on some paper at the back, and then we'll kind of discuss those questions with the panel of speakers here afterwards. So does that all make sense? Okay, so first up we'll have Mark Harris, who is an Anglican priest and professor of natural science and theology at the School of Divinity here in Edinburgh. After Mark, we will have Dr. Emily Messer, who is a primatologist and science communicator at Heriot-Watt University. And then we'll have Paul Ewart, who is a professor of physics at the University of Oxford, and he is the current chair of Christians in Science. And then Rachel Gilmour, a science communicator and tutor with a background in astronomy and astrophysics, will finish our group of discussions, our group of presentations. So without further ado, I'll welcome Mark up.
Thank you very much, Gavin. Really good to be with you. I should say, as a little bit more of introduction to myself, I guess my main interests in this come from, so I look after the whole kind of academic side of science and religion here in the University of Edinburgh. So I might sound a little bit more kind of theoretical than perhaps some other people who are going to speak. I don't know, we'll find out. But what I'm going to suggest in my 8 minutes or so is that the title we've been asked to speak to, talking together, question mark, very important, science and the church. These are the kind of phrases we often use at science and religion gatherings, but most of the words there are ciphers for other things, I'm going to suggest, and I will try and unpack that. And I will ask some rather obvious questions, but please bear with me as I try and unpack this stuff. And I want to say, I suppose, the kind of talking together thing instantly conjures up the question of dialogue between science and faith. In the academic study of science and religion, I have to be honest with you, we've become so fed up with dialogue. We generally tend to say these days it's a meaningless platitude, and that we have to dig much more deeply in order to try and get at what exactly are we doing here. And again, I will ask some obvious questions and hope that this makes some sense and doesn't appear too obvious. So first of all, I want to ask, what is the church here? Now, my background, I'm an Anglican, I'm a Catholic Anglican. If you ask me what the church is, I would start talking about the Holy Catholic Church, adherence to scripture, tradition, creeds, councils, and so on, Trinitarian belief. And I would say that includes all of the major Christian denominations, Protestant, Anglican, Catholic, Orthodox. But there are many denominations in that, and many individual congregations as well. And they have very, very different beliefs and very different ways often of relating to what we are calling science, the other big kind of thing there. So for instance, if you compare the way that conservative evangelical congregations in the southern United States tend to relate to science, compared with the congregations that I work with here in Edinburgh, Scottish Episcopalians, I mean, total world of difference here when we're talking about what science is and what's important in relating to science, and particularly the idea of dialogue with science. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to do this quite a lot because most of the terms here I understand as being kind of ciphers for something else. Okay, so very often with this particular kind of phraseology, when we talk about the church, we don't really mean the church in terms of the Holy Catholic Church. We mean particular kinds of Christianity and the ways that they react to science. What about science? Well, again, we find that probably not many sciences are in view here. We're thinking about particular areas of the sciences, and particularly the ideologies that they tend to conjure up. And also, especially going back to the kind of conservative evangelical background in the southern United States, there are a whole load of moral agendas that come up to do with, pro-life, for instance, gender, sexuality, climate change. I could go on. So it's not so much science here, really, as a whole load of other stuff that has somehow clustered around science in the modern kind of mind. In other words, science becomes a placeholder for a whole load of ideologies and moral questions. It's not science in general then, if we think science means empirical study of the natural and human worlds. So if we're a bit uncertain about what these terms mean once we start unpacking them, and I've suggested that dialogue is a bit uncertain as a piece of terminology as well, why do we keep talking about the need for dialogue between science and the church? Why do we do this when these are all just a whole series of code words for something else that might be quite complex? Well, I suggest that the answer is not difficult to find why we do this. It's because our secular culture assumes that science writ large and the church writ large are locked in conflict with each other in a fight to the death. And just by talking in this kind of way, we are buying straight into that myth that conflict is always there and it's always going to be there and we can do nothing about it and probably religion is going to die. I think we're buying straight into it, just using this terminology. And by the way, I'm not making this up. This is not just my own thoughts. In the academic study of science and religion, most people now would accept that viewpoint that I've just given you, that the problem with science and religion is not science nor religion, it's the and. Is there another way of looking at this which doesn't automatically buy into the myth of conflict? Well, I think there is. But first of all, we need to drop the idea that dialogue is the answer, dialogue between science and the church. Think for a moment about secularism as an ideology that underpins Western society. It's much more pervasive than you might realize, even among very fervent religious believers. So think for a moment about secularism. Generally, social scientists would say that secularism relies on this myth of conflict between science and religion, and vice versa. They kind of prop each other up, really. Why is that the case? Why does secular society assume, without questioning, that science and religion must conflict with each other? Well, it's a really complex question. Loads and loads of work has been done on it, but one of the obvious answers is that secularism assumes conflict between science and religion because it makes the truth much easier to grasp. Basically, you say that truth resides more in the science half of the pairing than in religion. So truth is progressive as science is progressive, but not religion. And that does allow for secular society to deal with religion much more easily. And it allows to be put in its place in comparison with the primary mode of truth-seeking these days, science. And it also means, and this is a very positive point, I would think, that because the religions are there, religious traditions can then be relativized because they've all been kind of put down in their place. They're no longer the universal sources of truth, of course, but it does mean that religious tolerance and pluralism drop out of that, or rather, fall out of that much more readily. So I would say one of the great positives of the secular worldview is that religious tolerance and pluralism are kind of natural and assumed everywhere. And these are things that those of us who have quite strong religious beliefs about the rightness of our own particular tradition always have to deal with, but generally we know we live in this kind of society and often value it in some rather conflicted way. So I'm nearly finished because I realize I probably have gone over my 8 minutes. Of course, I'd be really interested in hearing people's viewpoints about this religious tolerance and pluralism point. But the point I'm trying to get towards is that if you do away with conflict between science and religion, you then have the problem of asking yourself, well, okay, because I personally really value religious tolerance and pluralism, but I'm uncomfortable about conflict between science and religion. So if I do away with conflict, how then do I justify to myself and my fellow people who live in this country that religious tolerance and pluralism are good things? It becomes much, much more difficult to do it without that myth of conflict. Well, I mean, you can do it, but we need to be adult, as in the church is, about what is really standing behind all of these terms, many of them very complex moral questions that aren't really to do with science at all. They're about, and I mentioned some of them, gender, sexuality, blah, 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 blah. So my suggestion is that dialogue really isn't about science and the church so much as us with each other and other religious believers talking about these extraordinarily difficult moral questions which have somehow become attached to science. So I'm sure I'm going way over, and I will stop there. So thank you.
So I want to take a slightly different approach to this general topic of talking together and thinking more about science and the church. And when I was initially approaching this, I was thinking about it more from the essence of science, and in particular thinking more from my kind of background in primatology and psychology, and thinking when I'm talking about church here, I'm referring more to this idea of faith. But before I go into that and the kind of approach that I'm taking on that, I first wanted to, if people go, to draw your attention to my background and to see a bit more about where I'm coming from. So I am a primatologist. I work with monkeys and apes in Edinburgh Zoo and in the wild. And then I also work with young children from around about 4 up to 12 in both here in Edinburgh, the Lothians and Fife, and also a bit further afield in populations where children there don't have any access to formal schooling, still live very much a traditional way of living. And what I'm really interested in is social influences in their behaviour. So why they act in ways they do, and how do other individuals of their group or species, or even cross-species in the animals, interact with those behaviours. And through doing that and spending a lot of time in this area, I often come across some of these big topics you already mentioned: evolution, gender, stereotypes, social influences in general, conformity, majority biases, and things like that. But coming back more to the actual theme of this evening and this idea of science and the church. When I was initially looking at this and the best way to approach it, being a scientist, the first thing I was like, numbers. Let's look at the numbers. And from the Wellcome Trust Global Monitor report from 2018, they actually did report that about 61% of people globally say that religion is important in their daily lives. And this is obviously religions across the board. This isn't just Christianity, which would be my personal background, but also Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, all of these. But what I thought was even more interesting was that this report also showed that less than 3 in 10 people who identified with a religion, so that's again broad range of religion, so about 29% of them, say that science has never disagreed with their religious teaching. But what I'm really interested in is what about the other half of that, and those individuals who therefore perhaps said that it had agreed with them, and also those people that were on the fence, and those ones that were like, I'm still not sure. Now, a quick whirlwind through the history of science and faith, and they have a long, long history of being both in conflict, but also to an extent in harmony. If we go back and look at some of the great scientists who came up with a lot of these big ideas, a lot of them also did have a faith as well, and that we see played out in a lot of their writings as well as their approaches. So while we do have this history of conflict and harmony, and as we've just been hearing, these do vary from country to country. Again, we compare Western Europe in particular with the south of North America in particular, we might see some slightly differences depending on the area and the topics. But looking at this more from my own perspective and from my own studies of interacting with animals and young children and other scientists in this area, the thing that really struck me about this all is those common patterns between them. When I look at my faith and the study of behaviour in particular, I think there are very much commonalities that I take both to my approach of science and both in my approach to relationship with God. And I've tried to summarize them here for you. So these would be things like gathering evidence, and whereas in my line of work, that might be through making observations of the animals, or perhaps giving them a problem-solving task and looking to see who solves it first, and then how does that spread through the group, if it does. Or again, gathering evidence from reading the Bible, talking with other people, and that kind of element of community always comes into that. And then reporting those findings back, whether it's at a meeting like this, or whether it's in publications or things like that. And again, we see that within faith as well, with both theology and also even within the church, where you might have a minister perhaps, or someone who might report their findings from their study of the word. And then again, in both of them, we invite others to reproduce those findings. We invite others to check up on what we're doing, whether it's in science and get them to replicate our studies, or whether it's in the church where we ask people to go away and study the word and check what we're saying and those interpretations of them. And then asking questions. I think this is one of the biggest things that's come out in both my science and my faith. I still have a lot of questions from both reading the word, studying the word, looking into different aspects of the creation story, for example, of the interactions with the Israelites in the Old Testament, of Jesus and the disciples. Lots and lots and lots of questions there, and some of those that I might not get an answer to in this lifetime. But also thinking to my science, and like, I can go, and I'm terrible for doing this. I don't think people like going out with me too much to social gatherings, because I spend a lot of time observing people and being like, oh, look, so-and-so's interacting with this other individual. What does that tell us about their behaviour? I was in school just on Tuesday and was noting as the children came into the hall who was sitting with whom and why that might be. And you start to see that coming apart in that. So I think my parents would probably say that even from a young age, I've always been very much the why child and trying to find out more with a lot of those things. So I think we see that similarity again in both faith and science. And then also belief. I think there is a lot of belief involved in faith, why we believe the things we do, whether we believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the idea of the Holy Trinity with God, Father, Son, and Spirit. But also we sometimes see this in science. We see a lot of people, particularly when you're discussing with them about certain areas of science, they might be like, I believe in evolution. I believe in gravity. I believe in these certain aspects. And when you actually, again, go back to asking those questions and talking to them more about that, the source of those beliefs are also really interesting. And I think from them can then spark further discussion and investigation from that. And I wanted to show you some examples of how those similar patterns come out in both my work and in my journey with God. So one of the things I study is social learning. So this idea of learning from seeing it done. Or you might think of it in things like imitation, things like that. As you can see here, the father is holding his son up and the monkey is doing the same with their child. But what I want you to pay attention to is there's actually quite a lot going on in this figure, and we can break it down into three separate elements. That perhaps we might have an innovative event here. We don't know why this gentleman lifted up his child, but we're then also seeing this transmission now of information, where we're seeing that there's perhaps learning from the mother or the father in the young to imitate perhaps that behaviour. But also what's really interesting to me from a social perspective is, what about these other guys up the tree? They are seeing all this going on. What will they do next? Will we see this behaviour spread through the group? Will we then see this weird tradition that only exists in this one group of monkeys? When they see people, they all lift up their babies. What's going on there? How does that spread and develop into traditions and cultures? And what can we learn from that? And I'm also nearly out of time. So just looking again at how I apply that in my faith. So studying the word in particular. And in one way, this became really apparent to me this year in particular, was thinking about both the Christmas and the Easter messages. And we hear the same scriptures read every single year, or we go back through them. But the nice thing about the richness of the text is that every year there's a new little snippet of information, and perhaps something that you haven't thought about before. And if I take the Easter message in particular, this year I was really drawn to the attention of the tree from what the wood came from that Jesus was crucified on, and just thinking more about that in the creation story, and how when God created that tree and that tree came into existence, that he knew later on that the path for that tree would be the crucifixion of Christ, and just seeing how all these things often come together. So for me, science and faith help us to put things together, to learn more about the mechanism through science, and then through faith about what they mean. And one of the nicest ways that I think I can help to summarize that is this idea that for me as a Christian, everything is created by God. He is the primary cause, and he has revealed his purpose to us. But these are then recorded in the Bible, and we can then study that secondary cause in the physical forces, chemical interactions, the reactions, and those interactions of living organisms to find out how they shape life on Earth. So in essence, it's a bit like the study of an artist's painting, or perhaps a sculptured stone. And the more I study those stones or that piece of artwork, the more I can learn about the creator behind them. So in essence, what I would argue is that that dialogue between science and the church is really important for me, because I learn more about God's creative character. And through exploring the world that God created, I'm hoping that I can, first of all, acknowledge him as the ultimate source of everything, but also it allows me then to even worship God through the study of that science, through the study of his creation. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Emily. There's going to be a little bit of echoing here as we repeat some of these ideas and themes from the first two talks, but I hope you'll bear with me. I've actually just got one slide, and I just want to tell you in advance that it's something I saw on a friend's T-shirt. Okay? Get the message? Okay, so what I want to say tonight really is that there are two types of people. There are people in the church, and there are people who are not in the church. Now, that's not terribly profound, but because our first speaker did elucidate that it's a much more complicated picture than that. But I want to, broadly speaking, confine my remarks to two things. First of all, that there are the people who are in the church in some way or other, and there are people who are outside the church. And I want to say also that there are two reasons, basically, why the church and science need to engage with one another. And perhaps I'll try to use different words than dialogue. The first reason for the people who are inside the church is that, as we've already heard, that understanding science will lead to enhancing faith and our worship, because when we understand more about the creation that we see around us and in the distant parts of the universe, we get a picture of a much bigger God, not the sort of narrow, nationally tribal God that we sometimes see in the Old Testament. But even there, we get allusions to the one who was their God of the Hebrews was also the one who created the whole universe. We get that right at the very beginning. So understanding science enhances our understanding of God and his greatness, enhances our worship and our faith. The second reason is that for people who are churchgoers or even committed Christians as well, knowing more about science, understanding its nature in particular, helps develop a robust faith. And that's important in a world which is essentially antagonistic to the church. It helps us develop a robust faith that will enable us to defend what we believe against militant atheist attacks. And in particular, it will also equip the saints in their outreach to the world around us. So in terms of that first reason, enhancing our faith and worship, the first thing it does really is to help us read the Bible wisely. It's worth remembering that right from the earliest days of the church, whatever we want to describe it, the early church fathers approached the Bible in a number of different ways. And they had no shame or qualms about using what we would today call evidence-based reasoning to understand the Bible. They used their minds to think about reality as they saw it, to help them understand what was metaphor, what was allegory, what was history, and what kind of history it was, and so on. So they used their common sense, if you like, and all the gifts that God had given them to help interpret the Bible, because that really is part of what lies at the core of the conflict thesis. A mutually agreed misunderstanding of what the Bible is, both from many religious people and also from many non-religious people. The Bible is not science. It was never meant to be by the original authors, and the original hearers of the Bible and readers of it didn't expect it to be giving scientific explanations either. So, as we've just heard, actually, we can think of science as telling us answers to the questions about how, the mechanisms. One way of thinking about it is that, as Rabbi Jonathan Sacks puts it in his wonderful book, The Great Partnership, which I recommend to everybody, that science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean. So they're really answering different questions about the same reality, and that's the message that really we want to get across. And that will help us in the church understand our faith better and build a more robust faith. And that will be important also for our witness to the skeptical and cynical world outside. Because, of course, the second real reason why we need to engage in this conversation, nearly said dialogue, the reason why we need to think about how these two relate is that the church has a mission. Our Lord gave us a mission to the world, to go into all the world and to make disciples. And we have this lovely example of how to do that in the New Testament, in particular in Paul's missionary journeys. And when he arrives in Athens, we all know the story when he gets in Acts 17, where he arrives in Athens and is invited to speak at the Areopagus, where he interacts with the philosophers of the day, the Stoics and the Epicureans. And he starts where they are, about their religiosity and so on, and leads them towards Christ. But the thing that we often miss about that story is that that's actually not where he started. He started in the marketplace in Athens. He started talking to ordinary people, and he kind of earned the right to be invited to that more academic forum to explain his belief. So we've got to be out there meeting people, understanding their worldview, how they think about things, even how they think about the Bible, how they think about what science is, and why they think there's a conflict there at all. Because it's actually very interesting that if we start to think about how we approach the people, the second group, those who are outside the church, who don't see things the way we do, I think there are two reasons there, again, why it's important that we understand the relationship between science and faith. And the first one is that we need to be able to convince those millions of people out there, billions of people, who labor under this misconception that they have been sold a lie. They have been sold an untruth, that there is an inherent conflict between science and faith. There has been tensions about certain aspects throughout history, that's certainly true, but the real conflict stems from fairly recent developments in the late 19th century, in North America in particular. But we're faced with that. That's the way the world we now live in, that there's a pervading view out there that science and faith are in conflict. when I was at Faraday Institute a year or two ago, I was engaged partly in a bit of sociological research, and the folk at Theos, Nick Spencer and his team, did a very wide-ranging survey of the UK population and what they thought about science and religion. And the same number came up, actually, about 2/3. I think the figure was actually 67%, which is pretty close to 2/3 for a physicist. 2/3, 2 in 3 people thought that science and faith were in conflict, they were incompatible. But the interesting thing was, and the whole conclusion of that whole study was that the whole issue is, as we were hearing at the beginning, is much more complicated, it's much more nuanced than that. Because when you ask these people who think that science and faith are in conflict, well, what about physics and faith? Oh no, that's all right. What about chemistry and faith? Yeah, there's no problem there. And what about biology and faith? Well, okay, it's okay. When you're actually talking about specific sciences, they didn't seem to have any problem. There was just some notion, some idea that science per se was against faith. And so really what the problem was more not science itself, but a naturalistic assumption that nature is all there is. There's no such thing as spiritual reality. And that because science only deals with physical reality, that's all there is. But of course, you can immediately see the fault in that logic, of course. The confusion between the methods of science and its philosophy. Methodological naturalism is not the same as ontological naturalism, to use the big words, okay? So people mix up the methods of science with the underlying philosophy of it. So the first thing that we want to tell people of the two things out there in the world is that you're laboring under a misconception. There's no inherent issue of conflict between science and faith. They are looking at the same reality from different aspects, different perspectives, different dimensions of it. And the second thing I think is important to get across to them is that they need have no fear that they have to abandon their rational faculties. That in fact, when you look into science, in particular science, as I come as a physicist, and as I intimated earlier, that it gives us a bigger picture of God, who created the universe. Is much bigger than even folk are able to think about or contemplate. But the other interesting thing about being a physicist is you get to understand the difference between physics and metaphysics, and how to spot when some of our colleagues take that step from physics to metaphysics. And we should say, no, you can't do that. Physics is at the more fundamental level of sciences, and therefore there's a lovely story that Eric Van Auken tells us about in his accounts of his life in Oxford, when he met C.S. Lewis. And he went around with a group of students, and he noticed that quite a number of the Christians were scientists, and quite a lot of those scientists were physicists. And he came to the conclusion that the reason for that was that the biologists thought that they didn't have all the answers, but the chemists did. Basically, biology can be reduced to chemistry. But the chemists thought, well, not really. Fundamentally, it's physics. And so we don't have the answers, but the physicists do. And of course, the physicists know we don't have the answers because we can't answer that kind of question. And therefore, physicists are more open, if you like, to see the nature of science as it really is. And interestingly also, I think, from my own personal perspective, the kind of odd things you find as a physicist, the non-commonsensical nature of reality allows you and stretches your mind and opens them to possibilities. So the fact that we can think of a light as both a wave and a particle, two mutually exclusive things, as being one entity, has the analogy in the Trinity. We can think of God being three in one. So physics breaks our minds, if you like, from that narrow common sense view of reality and opens us to more possibilities. And I think that's what we can do as scientists who are Christians. Get out there and tell people that they're laboring under a misconception, that actually, when you look at it, science is full of evidence that points back to a rational order of things, a creator. The fact that we have laws of nature means there's a lawgiver inherently, and therefore there's lots of evidence there, not proof, but pointers to the existence of a mind and a personal mind behind the universe, that we can fit all our observations and make sense of it. We build up a coherent, rational picture, and that our faith is rationally justified. And so coming back again to the church, how do we encourage our brothers and sisters in the church of whatever denomination that science is not to be feared, is to be welcomed as a gift of God? We need to understand it. We need to be able to explain it and how it relates to our faith to the folk out there who are laboring under these misconceptions. So we've got to get our brothers and sisters to trust us first as fellow Christians. This is important, I think. When we're accepted as fellow believers, then we can listen to one another and do that humbly and graciously. And then make ourselves able to use the facilities that things like Christians in Science can provide, the kind of literature that we've seen earlier on the slides, and the wealth of speakers and talents in the various subjects that we can provide to help churches both internally enhance their faith and worship, but also in outreach. So let me finish there. I think I've just inside my time. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, hello everybody. My name's Rachel. Thank you for inviting me here. When I was asked to come and speak, I thought, oh gosh, me? What can I contribute? What can I say? Because I used to be an astrophysicist. I used to do science back over a decade ago. And then I had my children, and I was then involved in schools outreach and talking to schools about science and faith. But gradually that's had to take a back seat as my children have been born. I had one, my youngest was born at 25 weeks and has had a number of issues. My middle child is autistic and is partly homeschooled. So I found that more and more my life revolves around this tiny little bubble in the village that I live in and the church that I'm in. And I don't get a chance. I mean, literally coming on the train here was the first time I've been on the train on my own for 8 years. It's quite a big thing, me being up here. But what I can talk about is the grassroots, what it's like as a scientist in an ordinary church who doesn't have the academic life or all of those things. But what can we do just as scientists who are embedded in our ordinary church? How can we make a difference there? And I've got 3 points to cover. The first one is to be known as a scientist. The second is to be a source of wisdom. And the third one is to reach out. So starting off with being known. There's one body, but it has many parts. And part of who I am in the church is a scientist, but that's not the most obvious bit. It's much easier when you go to church to be on the flower rota, or you're one of the readers, or you help with the Sunday school, or whatever it is you happen to do. Do people in church know that you're a scientist? And if not, how do we make sure that they do? Because purely by existing in our local church, we make a difference. We don't have to have answers. We dispel myths purely by existing. I think there's, in the young generation that I work with quite a lot, there's less awareness of the conflict between science and faith than maybe there used to be in the past, which is very encouraging, but it's still there. And we've got a 14-year-old in our church family who no longer comes to church. He's recently stepped back from school, church and everything, and has said to his parents recently, I don't believe in God anymore. I believe in science. And his parents, they're a social worker and a linguist, they weren't sure, but what they could say was, but what about Rachel? And what about Keith? And what about the other scientists in our church? They didn't know the answers, but they knew that we existed. And that immediately gets rid of one of the barriers to faith. If you can just say, look, I'm a scientist and I'm a Christian, so it really can't be that much of a problem. And if you can build up that trust, as you were saying, if you can build up that trust, then we can do 3 things. We can help people not to fall away when they come across questions. We can help them to grow in their faith and to grow to understand more of God. And we can inspire our young people to actually want to know more of God. And practically, we do this just by existing. There was a lad in our church, a man who was known as Stephen the Scientist. He had a surname, but I don't know what it was. He was in the church for about 3 years, but we didn't know what his surname was because he was Stephen the Scientist. That was his identity. It was almost how he introduced himself, how we introduced him. He was great at just being a scientist. Now, he worked in some sort of chemical stuff at Grangemouth, I'm not quite sure what, but he was passionate about science and he was passionate about God, and that really came over. So what can we do practically? How do we engage with our churches? Really small things, like Gavin had a t-shirt earlier. If you think people don't know you're a scientist, I'm not one for t-shirts, but some people love the t-shirts with the slogans. If I spot someone with a NASA t-shirt on, or something like that, that be my background. I go up and have a chat to them about science. Oh yeah, I used to do that. That was really cool. Talk about things. Put an article in a church magazine. I went to a conference about science and Christianity. It was really interesting. If anyone's interested, come and talk to me. Probably no one will come and talk to you, but they'll have read it and they'll know. And if they did have a question, maybe they'd approach you in the future. Talking to children in particular. Did a kids talk a while back on infinity? Great one for an astrophysicist, talking about God being infinite. Great fun. Or talking about to a youth group and giving your testimony. There are lots of ways that you can share with your congregation that you are a scientist and a Christian. And that really just helps to build that relationship, break down barriers. The second point, so my first point was just to be known as a Christian, a scientist, sorry. The second point is to be a source of wisdom. Peter says, as each has received a gift, use it to serve one another. And I just always think, well, I'm an extragalactic astrophysicist. There aren't really that many questions. If it's about black holes, I'm good. But, you know, even the sun and stars, I don't know much about those. That's my scientific brain thinking. That's the way I think when I'm a scientist. Oh, that's not my area. That's not my area. But actually, to my church family, I am a scientist. Which means that I can analyze data and read papers and see beyond the headlines. And they will come to me with all sorts of science questions that I know nothing about. But what I can do is I can walk with them. I can be prepared to try and answer these questions and to walk alongside them, to use some pastoral skills to pray desperately for some help, and to walk alongside them in these questions which they don't know where to look for answers, and they've come to their church scientist. So if we're known in our church, I'll give you a couple of examples. People talk to me about neurodiversity. They talk to me about sex and gender. A new Christian recently, 19-year-old lad, came up and wanted to talk about evolution. And COVID vaccine. People want to know, should I be vaccinated? Should I get my kids vaccinated? What's the evidence? I read this in the paper. My mum sent me this article. What's the evidence? And they trust scientists to give them some insight in that. They trust Christian scientists. So it's really important that we're embedded in our local churches and actually able to have these conversations. And my third point is reaching out. The psalmist says, your works are wonderful. I know that full well. I know that. There's a passion for God's creation out there, but how do we pass that on? How do we pass that on to those outside the church and to the next generation? One example is to do science experiments, to put science into our church life whenever we can. So one thing I help run is a light party. It's an alternative to Halloween. We do it for the kids in the village. We do a light party at the end of October. And we now have a little stall where we have light science experiments. And some of them point to biblical things like we have about the light in the darkness. And it's run by a few teenagers from the church. And these are teenagers who are into science. One of them is one of my sons, and they're very into their science. And it gives these young scientists a chance to serve in their church using science and inspire them. And it gives them a chance to show the rest of the world that there's not a conflict here. In fact, this is God's amazing creation. God made light, and look at all these cool things light can do. It's great to be able to get science into the church. Another example is prayer stations. If you have a church that has prayer stations around, you can have ones based on scientific experiments and finding out things about God's world. There are so many ways to explore science within our church. We just need to think a little bit about it. And my final example I was going to give is when I'm giving a talk in public, a talk in schools, not that I do much of this anymore, I'm talking in public, I always try to mention that I'm a Christian, and that's quite a difficult thing to do when you're going and giving a pure science talk. But what I do is I have a slide on stereotypes. And I say, you don't have to be a man to be a scientist. I'm not. You don't have to have a beard. I definitely don't have a beard. You don't have to like Star Trek. It's fine if you do like Star Trek, but I'm not a big fan of Star Trek. You don't have to be an atheist. I'm not an atheist. I'm a Christian, and I know people who are Christian and Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim and atheist and agnostic. And I just drop it in there as a kind of dispelling myths slide. And the number of times someone will come up to me afterwards and say, I'm a Christian too. That was really inspiring. I was really excited to hear that. Just to throw little things out there, just to show that we exist. And I hadn't talked about God at all in the talk, but that little link there had really helped to build somebody up. So, just to go over my 3 points again, be known as a scientist. Find a way to make sure that your church family know that you are a scientist. or that you're interested in science, that you have a passion for it. Be a source of wisdom, not just in your specialist area, but in every area that people come to you. Try to help them in that, in all the ways that you can, with humility, obviously, because it's not your area, and reach out. And let's show the world that we know a God who made this world, and it's awesome. Thank you.
So thank you to our 4 speakers. There's lots of things to unpack there after our break, but it's great how the talks all kind of overlaid over each other and went on quite a narrative together. So we'll be conversing rather than dialoguing. We'll be thinking of some more practical things to do about dispelling myths shortly after the break. So help yourself to refreshments, and we'll come back in about 10 or 15 minutes. If you have questions you want to write down, there's pen and paper at the back, or we might just send the roving mic round if you're feeling brave as well. Okay, see you in a few minutes. So we'll just have a kind of 15, 20-minute chat based on your presentations that you've just given to us now. Like I was saying before the break, they've really overlaid nicely. So I was writing down questions while they were going on. And for Paul's talk, I was like, oh, okay, what practical things might we do to kind of increase the profile of science and the kind of engagement of science in the church? And then Rachel stood up and answered that. So thank you, Rachel. But that, I think there's still more that could be unpacked maybe there. So those, you see, it's very practical suggestions and the kind of subtle things we can do. Are there less subtle things we can do to maybe help church leadership to integrate science more fully into kind of Christian teaching? Does anyone want to comment on that?
Can I comment on something else? Can you hear me?
You are the chair, yes.
Yeah, I think that before you discuss that, it's important to realize the context. And over the last 4 or 5 years of thinking about this issue and trying to get the church engaged with science, I've come to see that, if I didn't know it before, science and faith is not the church's #1 priority. People are more concerned about the cost of living at the moment. People are struggling with family problems and social issues, personal problems and so on. That this kind of quasi-academic problem is in the background. And for that reason, ministers in particular just don't have time to devote to it, really, because they're very busy putting out fires in their congregations and helping people and pastorally preparing their sermons and so on. So we've got to realize the context in which we're trying to get this message across. And the first thing, I think a lot of ministers realize it is an issue, but there are more important ones for them at the moment. And they haven't quite made the connection that if actually we can address this, it might help some of the other things. But if we can break down that barrier for people out there, that they start to come to church and give us a hearing, that actually might be beneficial for the church more generally. But it takes a leap of faith, to take that step, say, okay, is it worth investing my time and energy or people's in the church's energy to do that? Because the payoff will not be very quick. It'll take a long time for that to develop.
And then just to pick up on both those points there, really. One of the things we are very much seeing, not only in the churches, but I also would argue in the education sector, is a lack of engagement. And I think that's probably one area we need to tackle. And I think much like the traditional education model is a professor, a teacher, somebody stood up at the front of the room talking at people. And there's less possibility there for that interactive engagement element. And we're starting to try new methods with education, in particular, in more formal education. But we see this when we look at other populations who don't have formal education, but yet are thriving. And I think from that is perhaps also within the church, maybe we need to look at our model of delivery, or rather than it being somebody in a vicar, a minister in a pulpit talking at people, is actually practicing more of those Jesus principles of being the hands and feet, like you were saying previously about being like, we're right here, we are working, we are in these areas, and also engaging with people in their level of need. And I think we're all slightly guilty of this. You meet somebody, you're like, hi, how are you? You're not necessarily interested in how actually they are. It's just more of a welcome statement. And I think more going to people at their need when we are especially in such a needy time.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that. And I think, as you say, churches do have a lot of very important things that they're dealing with at the moment. And so I wouldn't ever expect our local church, for example, to have a whole sermon or a series or anything on this, but dropping little bits in there. The little drops, I think, are very helpful. I also think that for the ministers, for the leaders of the churches, knowing who to turn to, knowing where to direct people to is really important. And yeah, I can think of a couple of examples just in the last few weeks where the minister has said to me, oh, you need to talk to this person because they've got some questions. As new people are coming to faith, as people are wrestling with things, someone's saying, oh, well, I'm fine, but my husband, he's a very big believer in science. What can I say to him? So questions like these that actually it's far more relational. You don't need it preached from the front. You need to have somebody to go and have a chat to. And that's where I think training up scientists is really key. There was the program Scientists and Congregations was up here about a decade ago. I was involved in it, and the aim was to get scientists to talk to their congregations, to talk about being a scientist, and to be one of these people that people can come to with questions, because for most people it's not at the forefront of their mind, but for some people it is a really big issue. And I think particularly, we at least in our church have a lot of young people who are very inspired by science, and it's important for them to see that through the eyes of their faith, and to see, when I'm doing science, that's God's creation we're looking at. So the more we can inspire, the better as well.
Thank you. These are just some rather unformed thoughts, just to say something a bit different to what's already been said, which of course very, very helpful to hear. I think the COVID pandemic was a pretty important watershed in the way that the church, and I'm thinking, because I don't like you saying the church, the Anglican churches in particular, because those are the ones I'm familiar with, the way they relate to science. Because, I mean, you'll all remember it well. What a terrible period of history for all of us. And I remember the early weeks of the first lockdown very well. Everyone was terrified. The scientists seemed to have no idea at the time about what to do, getting all this conflicting advice. And yet within, was it 9 months? There were vaccines coming out. That was the miracle. Scientists doing their thing. And wow, we were told that it could take 10 years, but in fact it was about 9 months. Incredible. And the church leaders were, throughout this, were really rather unimpressive, I think, because they simply weren't trained to know how to relate to science and how to try to translate it to people who were experiencing, just like we all were, very human worries about the future and life and death and things like that. And I felt that was a time which showed a real failing in the church, and the way in which the churches train their ministers without enough science. So that's just a thought.
Yeah, I'd just be interested to know, do any churches have scientists in, official roles in the same way, like a poet laureate or like Scotland's got a national astronomer? Do churches have scientists?
I think I've heard of some dioceses in England that have a kind of science missioner, but it's only like a handful of examples. So it would be nice if they could have a science advisor in every diocese or something.
Thank you. Yes, it's very token. So even the issue of training Anglican ministers, trainees, any science, it's pretty hard getting it into the curriculum because it isn't seen as being very important compared with, heavy-duty theology.
I think ECLAS, Equipping Christian Leaders in the Age of Science, has done an excellent job in getting quite a few seminaries and theological colleges training ministers to adopt a module in science and faith. and some of them have even become compulsory modules. It's up to the college itself to decide, but the fact they were able to get that into an already crowded curriculum was a step in the right direction. So there's progress being made, and it'd be great if we can build upon that. In my own experience in my own church, we've just started a month of outreach with a picture of a cow going moo, okay, M-O-O, month of outreach. But the interesting thing was the first thing they wanted in that series of talks was a talk on science and faith, because they wanted to clear the ground, okay? They wanted to be right up front and say, look, this isn't a big issue. Science and faith are go quite happily, and so I got asked to kick that series off. So, and I think that can be repeated elsewhere if churches want to have outreaches like that and have an element of addressing the science issue. Christians in Science can provide speakers to do that.
So yeah, we're picking up on the thread of kind of how to get this as more of a priority in front of churches, or less maybe more of a priority, but more part of the discussion and the dialogue to show the value and the use of science within a church context, not necessarily just on apologetics or theological teaching. What are the areas you think that science can contribute to in church teaching? So we have the usual big bangers like the Big Bang and evolution, but actually what are the kind of more urgent, more practical areas that we can be talking about?
Well, I think it's important as scientists that we can help congregations understand the science relating to ethical and moral questions like abortion, end-of-life care, human enhancements, things that people are often misinformed about the science. For example, in vaccine hesitancy, there was a lot of rumours basically going around that the vaccine was derived from human embryos. Now, there was a grain of truth in that, of course, because the original strain of cells that were used to culture the vaccines way back 50 years ago started with an aborted fetus. But the generations of cells cultivated from that, and nowadays they don't use those cells anymore. There's no human embryonic tissue in the vaccine. But that was used as a scientific argument for not having a vaccine, because it's a moral issue then. You're justifying abortion. But the science probably understood, said, no, that's not true. Modern vaccines do not use embryonic tissue. So it's important that we're able to explain these issues to people. Okay.
Yeah, and I think the other probably big hitter at the moment would be climate change, would be another big one. And spanning from that, vaccines, even outside the COVID vaccine, other vaccines have previously been in the news and caused a lot of conflict, in particular where one or few scientists have made a statement about something and then it's been picked up by the media and taken off. The one that immediately springs to mind is the MMR and autism. And I think although that's now been proven not to be true, as is often the case when these headlines come out, they're on page 1, and then when the retraction comes out, it's on like page 15. So I think some of it, again, is where that science communication is very important. And I think not just hitting these big hot topics, but also making it accessible to people perhaps aren't always from a scientific background. Science can often be quite challenging. Like we were talking about this earlier when we're comparing biology and physics, and how often even the language that we use can be difficult for people. And I think bearing that in mind and including accessibility within that could be somewhere where the church in particular could really help.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to draw the distinction between what the local church can do and what the wider church can do, because the local church is not going to have experts in many, many fields. And I think that the most important thing we can do to help the local church is show them where they can look, teach them, because you can't give all the answers, but if they know where they can look, if they know how to find information, then that really helps. So if you're a pastor or a minister and someone comes to you with a question, you know where to look for it. I think as a scientist in a local church, the main thing for me is just that sense of awe and wonder, looking at God's creation, particularly working with children and getting that in from the beginning, that when you look at science, you look at God's creation, but also for adults, just not thinking always about the tricky things, but just looking and going, wow, that's amazing. I know who made that. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, awe and wonder. I mean, this is clearly something that science majors on, particularly with relationship to faith. So often, though, it's, stars that we see, rather than, I don't know, chemistry of benzene or something like that. I do occasionally hear people working in my own area in condensed matter physics who can do the kind of, I'm a Christian and I love the fact that I work on heavy fermions and I can tell you all about the glories of God from the kind of blah, 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 blah. Yeah. And I think, wow, this is incredible. The people who are also able to translate that into terms that ordinary people can understand who don't have that training, that is such an amazing skill. And some of these people sort of travel the country doing this. I think scientists who are Christians, it would be a great skill to learn because you can often communicate massive enthusiasm for science simply by talking in enthusiastic terms about why you do what you do and what you think you're doing in glimpsing the divine mysteries. So, yeah, I think scientists should give talks about what they do, however mundane it might seem.
So just as we're closing, I'd like each of you, if possible, off the top of your heads, to recommend one resource, a book or a website or a film that you think everyone who wants to do good dialoguing about science and faith should be aware of. Maybe a book that's inspired you or something you read somewhere. Could even be a book you've written yourself.
I'll start off. So one of the actual places that actually got me first into my PhD and actually led me into that area, particularly as a Christian moving into science and not really being from an academic background or anything like that, and being like, actually, I'm interested in learning, I want to study more, and then that leading me off into PhD and then research and an academic career. And that was actually the organization Christians in Science, and their resources and interacting with them, and through them meeting up with fellow Christians in an organization called God and the Big Bang, which goes into schools and talks to kids about science and faith. And for me, their activities and their resources helped to not only make me better at my science, but more importantly, helped me to reconcile some of these areas where previously I had seen conflicts myself, but then actually helped me move through them and actually see more of those collaborative elements. So a lot of like the resources you saw on the screen at the start, and you just interacting with actual human people, not just the text, but actually people who live and work science, faith together.
I'm not going to be much help because I can't remember the name of the author or the book. But there's an organization called Biologos in the States, and it's one of the ladies who's very involved in that, but I can't remember the name, sorry, but it's this fantastic book that goes through the conflict points, particularly on the evolution and the creation, and goes through a whole range of different viewpoints and ideas, and just gives the plus and the minus, the strong, the weaknesses and the strength of each one. And I never realized there were so many different possibilities of interpretations of Adam and Eve. And I'm not a great reader of theology, I'm afraid. I'm not. I'm much more practical, pastoral person. But just to have it written really concisely, or here's one opinion, here's another opinion, here's another opinion, here's a fourth opinion, in 6 or 7 pages was just really helpful for me when talking to people, because then I can understand where they're coming from and say, well, okay, so you don't agree with that one, but then there's this opinion as well, and this one. Just knowing that there are so many different opinions out there of the difficult questions was really helpful without having to wade through academic stuff, because I'm not a great reader.
Thank you. Yes, I can recommend a book by a very good friend of mine who died recently of cancer, Tom McLeish. You may well have heard of him. He wrote a book in 2014 called Faith and Wisdom in Science. And was a condensed matter physicist, and saw him give talks many, many times where he would intersperse the content of the talk with pictures of molecules and things like that, and talk about kind of, his awe and wonder at the physics of proteins and molecules and protein folding and things like that. And it was, of course, his enthusiasm was absolutely palpable. And he would often, almost invariably actually, go into the book of Job and kind of talk very eloquently about particularly passages like where God speaks out of the whirlwind to Job. And he says, when scientists read this, they absolutely come alive because it's talking about real science and real nature. Anyway, he would. The book is quite difficult to. It's structured in a sort of almost like a series of vignettes which kind of explode upon you, but it's absolutely full of this awe and wonder, together with some pretty chunky engagement with the Book of Job. So Faith and Wisdom in Science by Tom McLeish.
I think I've already mentioned the book that I read recently. It's written from a Jewish perspective by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who died recently. The Great Partnership. Absolutely wonderful book. And it has recommendations from people who are not believers, who were impressed by the cogency of the arguments. And it's helpful for us as Christians to see this issue from a Jewish perspective as well, and their understanding of particularly the Old Testament and how they see the harmony, because it's never been anything like the problem within Judaism as it is within Christianity, this science conflict idea. And he's very sympathetic and appreciative of the contribution of Christianity to the progress of science. So it's an excellent book. So The Great Partnership by Jonathan Sachs.
Thank you all. I think that point of reading beyond our own immediate spheres is really, really helpful, because we'll be arrogant to assume we have everything tied down and buttoned down, especially when science and technology continue to develop and continue to introduce new ideas that we have to wrestle with afresh each day. So I think tonight, what I'm going to take away is, Mark's point about these questions that get asked about science and faith in the church, but they're not necessarily science and faith questions, but science and faith has been hooked onto them as a way of discussing them, and being more aware of that. Emily's point about the kind of methodology almost of science and religion, and how we work through questions in science and religion being remarkably similar. And maybe that's something that we can put across to people in our churches. So they don't have to be afraid of not just science, but the method of science and the way of doing science, and show them that it's actually something that they're already familiar with from other areas in their lives. And then from Rachel and Paul, we've both had kind of talk of trust being key to this dialogue as well, and like helping people who are not scientists and not familiar with science, but have read in the newspapers fears about vaccines, climate change running out of control. Fear is an increasingly big problem for these people. So to introduce people who they can trust, who can reassure them, while still being realistic about the scope of problems, I think that's a powerful way that we as scientists can help the church. So can we have a final round of applause for our brave speakers?